Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Bonsai Network podcast. Once again, I'm your host, Bjorn Bjorholm, and I want to thank you for joining me on this brand new episode. In this particular episode, I thought what we would do is maybe get into a little bit of sort of my thoughts on what bonsai is, really the definition of bonsai. You know, the whole basis of the podcast is it's all about bonsai, but if we haven't defined our terms up front, it's kind of hard to talk about what the subject really is in any deeper sort of level. So what I'd like to do is dive into my thoughts behind the art in terms of where the word comes from, what it's sort of transformed into today, and what it means to me definitionally. So this, I think, will hopefully give you a little bit of insight into sort of how I approach bonsai to some degree, and maybe when you're looking at my particular works going forward, you might be able to see this definition sort of visually in front of you in each piece, and that's my goal anyway. So, this may not align with your idea of what bonsai is, and that's totally fine. But for me, this is how I define bonsai, and this is how I approach the art from a definitional level. First and foremost, the word bonsai consists of two kanji characters or Japanese characters. Actually, technically, they're Chinese characters. Before we jump into this, I just want to give sort of a basic explanation. Japanese has three writing systems, which makes it a very difficult language to learn. But one of those writing systems is kanji, and kanji were the characters that were brought over from China, adopted, and transformed into a portion of Japanese language. So anytime you read a sentence in Japanese, you'll have kanji characters, and you'll have both of the other writing systems, hiragana and katakana, in a single sentence. So all of those characters sort of intermingle with one another throughout the language. But for this particular word, bonsai, it's made up of two kanji characters, so two Chinese characters that have been adopted into Japanese. The first of these symbols or characters is bon, which means tray or container, and the second character is sai, which means to plant. So in other words, bonsai can be loosely translated as to plant in a container. This is pretty simple, but why then don't we consider every container plant or container-grown plant as a bonsai? What is it that sort of separates bonsai art from other similar horticultural practices? Maybe there's a broader element of artistic or aesthetic practice that we can use as a distinguishing factor. So let's take a look at that. This would certainly narrow the field of view in terms of what bonsai is, but it fails to eliminate other areas of ornamental horticultural practice, including niwaki, topiary, espalier, which also utilize aesthetic design principles applied to living plant material. In fact, many of these principles are directly translatable for use in bonsai culture, particularly those applied to Japanese niwaki or garden trees, which are the trees that you would see in a lot of the famous gardens throughout Japan. In a recent vlog, actually, on YouTube, I talked a little bit about Katsurarikyu in Kyoto and Ginkakuji in Kyoto, which are two of my favorite places, favorite gardens to visit in Japan. And both of those gardens are full of niwaki, or these large garden trees. And a lot of the techniques are translatable from bonsai to niwaki. So for example, some of the black pine techniques, the decandling techniques that we use for black pines in bonsai art, those techniques are actually translatable over to the larger niwaki black pines that could be 4, 5, 6 meters tall. It's just on a different scale. So maybe then there might be a narrower or a more specific set of design parameters that we could use as a foundation on which to define the term bonsai. Of course, this, again, is a little bit of a treacherous road to go down because not only are many of the design principles that we utilize in bonsai also translatable to garden-trained and container-grown niwaki, and in fact, they're nearly identical in a lot of cases, but creating such specific design parameters will necessarily stifle artistic expression, and of course, it will inevitably limit our later ability to persuade other people of the value of bonsai as a form of art. And this is something that within the bonsai community, calling bonsai art it's our passion. It's what we do. So bonsai is an expression of ourselves and is therefore an artistic endeavor. Notably in Japan, a lot of the bonsai professionals don't necessarily view bonsai as art. They view it more as a craft. So it's a little bit different perspective. But of course, there are artistic elements that each of those individual professionals put into their art form. So overall, in totality, of course, I consider it an art, and I would would assume that a lot of you listening out there also consider it an art. So, of course, to define or to use really specific design parameters to define bonsai, it's going to limit our ability to convince people outside of the bonsai community that bonsai is, in fact, an art form. There's another common assertion that I hear quite a bit in defining bonsai, and that is that the trees must be small. Well, then how small? Are there any limits to the size of a bonsai? Do they have to be within a certain size range? Well, sort of to answer that question, maybe it's good to take a look at sort of the contemporary Japanese context. So there are actually size limitations in bonsai, but only at certain exhibitions. So only at, for example, the Kokufu 10 or the Japanese National Exhibition, there are actually size parameters. And this is only due to the size limitations of the museum, the Tokyo To Bijutsukan, or the Tokyo Metropolitan Museum of Art. There are size limitations because the venue itself is relatively small. So what are those size limitations there? Well, basically, they're broken down. The trees are broken down into 3 separate size categories. So you have shohin trees, which are anything up to about 20 centimeters measured from the top of the pot to the apex of the tree. So, it's about 8 inches or so. Then you have chuhin sized trees, which are trees that measure basically between 38 to 45 or 46 centimeters. So what's that about? 45 centimeters is 18 inches. So up to about 18, 19 inches or so, again, measured from the top of the pot to the top of the tree. So those would be a chuhin sized tree. And then you have ogata, or large bonsai, and those are anything that are above and beyond the chuhin sized trees. They typically at the Kokufu are going to measure somewhere between, say, 60 centimeters, which is about 2 feet, up to about 1 meter. That seems to be about the limit for the size of the trees that go into the show. The height of the tree, it doesn't really matter that much. It's more of the width and the depth of the plant that causes the problems at the Kokufu. So obviously, the taller the tree, typically the wider they are side to side and front to back. So they do sort of end up capping out around 90 centimeters to 1 meter. So what's that, about 3 to 3.5 feet, somewhere around there. So, those size limitations, again, they're specifically for the Kokufu, and they're specifically in place for the, based on the size limitation of the actual venue itself. So it's not to say that bonsai have to fall within these categories, but those categories exist for a reason in Japan. So, when I travel overseas, for example, I went to India back in August of 2017. I was blown away by the size of the trees there. If you guys haven't seen the vlog that I put out during that trip, we actually had to move some of the trees with a crane. And I'm not talking like a little crane. It was a big, big, big crane because some of the trees were so big. So they brought out these metal pipes. We put the pipes underneath the pots. We brought the crane out, and then we attached basically like a canvas sort of rope system from the crane to those metal pipes under the pots, lifted those up and moved them across the garden so that we could put them in a place where we could work on them in the shade. So, there are no real size limitations, in my opinion, to bonsai. Obviously they don't have to be, you don't have to be able to carry the trees by hand. You can move them with cranes depending on your location. Again, I've seen the same thing in China as well, and in Vietnam too. Massive, massive trees. In the States, trees are starting to get larger and larger. So, I don't think that size limitation is really a good defining factor for defining what bonsai is. Okay, so if we know that, defining certain artistic parameters doesn't really work for us, if we know that, just putting the tree in a container doesn't define it as a bonsai, we know that size limitations don't define bonsai, well, then maybe there's an argument that can be made for a species-based definition of bonsai. So in other words, can we narrow the field of the definition of bonsai by eliminating certain species from inclusion as bonsai? I'm often asked by the general public if the word bonsai refers to only one species of plant, typically a juniper or a pine or a maple. And of course, the answer to that is no, of course not. You can use basically any species of tree that has a woody trunk for use in bonsai culture. However, there are some limitations in terms of creating a balanced design based on the leaf or needle size or foliage size of the tree. So, if you wanted to use something with a leaf that was, 30 centimeters across, a foot across, obviously that's not going to make a very good proportional bonsai unless your tree is going to be, 3 meters tall or 4 meters tall, then you might be okay. But again, most bonsai we're dealing with are going to be somewhere between, say, like the 8-inch to 4-foot range, somewhere in there. So a foot wide leaf size isn't really the best option. So typically when we're looking for plant material, we're searching for trees that have a naturally occurring, relatively small leaf size. So we're artificially selecting species that are going to work in bonsai culture to create a nice, well-balanced, well-proportioned final design. So the leaf size is small, and of course, the smaller the overall tree, the smaller the leaf size should be. The bigger the tree, maybe the coarser the foliage, so that it looks a bit more in proportion. And you actually see this quite often in Japan when trees are grafted. So, for example, if let's say a Tohoku Shinpaku from the Tohoku region of Japan gets collected from the mountains, the foliage on those trees is typically very leggy. It's very similar to very similar to Sierra juniper in the States. So very leggy. Grows quite quickly. It's just not a great foliage type for bonsai. So, depending on the size of that Tohoku Shinpaku when it was collected and the eventual size that the artist or the creator wants to make that tree out to be, they'll select a different coarseness of foliage of Itoigawa or some other variety or cultivar of juniper to graft to that tree. So in other words, if the collected Tohoku Shinpaku is more of a shohin-sized tree, they'll use a very, very, very fine, highly cultivated, very fine version of Itoigawa foliage and graft that to that, so it's in proportion with the size of the tree. If it's a medium-sized tohoku that was collected, they might use a medium grade or a medium coarseness foliage to graft to those trees, and then of course with the bigger trees they'll use a little bit coarser foliage. That way you get a nice sort of balance with the coarseness of the foliage versus the size of the overall tree. So again, I don't think that limiting the species of trees that we use for bonsai necessarily gives us a good definition of it. But again, you do have to take into consideration certain characteristics of trees that you choose to utilize as bonsai. So let's set this one aside because I don't think that this really gives us a great reference point for defining bonsai. Now, another thing that I often hear is that bonsai should be viewed from only one front, from a single view or a single front. So maybe this could be a defining factor of the term bonsai. While this is certainly true in many cases, though, it's not really a foundational element of bonsai, in my opinion. So bonsai often possess qualities that are visually appealing from a number of different positions, and those may be exploited to varying degrees in the evolution of the tree's design over its life. So I myself have frequently argued that bonsai are to be viewed from one particular front angle or height, and while I definitely hold firmly to this view, I would make the argument that this is the case only as it applies to a tree at any one point in its development as a bonsai. So bonsai necessarily change over time through natural and cumulative processes, and this invariably affects the sort of chosen design of any given artist at any one point in time. So, as each time a bonsai is worked or redesigned or restyled, subtle or sometimes very dramatic changes occur, making whatever chosen front of a particular artist at that particular time very, very short or fleeting at best in the total life of the tree. So while these snapshots in time represent the efforts and tastes of a given artist, they are definitely going to fade quickly because the trees grow, the branches elongate, branches die, trees pass from one artist to the next. So to say that that this particular design is the only one design that's best for the tree and that's what it's going to stay at or stay looking like forever is just not the case. So this is part of the dynamism, I think, and uniqueness of bonsai as art, and it should be embraced and experienced in the journey of every single tree. So where then does this leave us now in our pursuit to objectively define bonsai? So thus far, the discussion has sort of revolved around subtracting the elements that do not define the word. So going forward here, let's attempt to sort of parse out the certain ideas or different elements that actually add to the definition of bonsai. So first, let's discuss the medium with which we work in bonsai art, and of course that is living plant material. There are absolutely no exceptions, in my opinion, to this fundamental component of bonsai. So yes, it is often the case that entire portions of individual plants are intentionally killed off for various design purposes, and yes, deadwood features are sometimes incorporated in multi-trunk and other compositions. For example, a dead trunk will actually be placed in a multi-trunk composition to add the effect of fire damage or a dead tree in a larger forest, a very natural kind of look to the thing. But this in no way, in my opinion, detracts from the core fact that bonsai necessarily requires living plant material to be considered as a bonsai. Otherwise, you might as well call it what it is, which is deadwood art or driftwood sculpture, or basically a dead stick in a pot. The next thing, by definition, this living plant material is, of course, at risk of no longer being alive or being dead, and thus to lose its status as a bonsai. So it is then imperative upon us as creators, designers, hobbyists, enthusiasts of bonsai art to hedge against this eventual inevitability by utilizing any number of scientifically based horticultural techniques to make sure that the tree survives and to protect a given plant's longevity and its overall status as a bonsai. So by limiting the growth potential and root development of a plant, we are invariably weakening the tree over time, obviously. But it's incumbent upon us and totally necessary for us to counter this inevitable decline of the tree by utilizing proper techniques. So not only to prop up the health of the plant, but also to exploit, whether by inducing or limiting growth habits conducive to attaining whatever subjective design goals we value. So whatever we are looking to develop and design out of the tree, or to pull out of the tree in terms of its design, we have to make sure that we're employing the proper horticultural techniques to make sure that the tree survives, and more importantly, that the tree thrives. So, when you go into the mountains and you take a tree out of the mountains, it could be a tree that's 300, 400, 500 years old, nice old Rocky Mountain juniper, for example, or an Itoigawa juniper from Japan, or a giant Scots pine from Italy or from Spain. When you go and collect that tree out of the mountain, while it's in the mountains, it may be surviving, but it's not thriving. It's holding on. It's barely holding on to life. And that's what gives the tree its character. That's where the deadwood features come from. It's the interplay or the fight against nature and the natural elements that are surrounding the tree and affecting the tree. But the tree is not necessarily thriving. It's surviving, maybe putzing along. But again, that's what gives it its character. But when we go into the mountains and we take the tree out of the mountains, put it in a pot, we have the opportunity to make that tree thrive. So some of the trees that I've been working on lately in the States, they're collected Yamadori, for example, lots of Rocky Mountain junipers that I've been working on lately. These trees are sometimes 500 years old. And when I get them from the mountains, they drop, maybe 50% of their foliage is gone. It just falls completely off because the tree's been shocked. But when I get it in the pot and I start to fertilize it properly, start to provide the proper water, the proper light, the proper horticultural techniques, those trees then begin to push massive amounts of growth. And the growth that the trees are putting out in a single growing season is sometimes 3, 4, 5, 10 times the amount of growth that they would be putting out in a single growing season in their original growing environment in the mountains. So by providing proper fertilizer and providing proper horticultural techniques and water and light and all of those different things, we're able to take these trees that are surviving and make them thrive. But it's incumbent upon us to continue that process through the life of the bonsai to guarantee that the tree is going to live and thrive. So perhaps the most unique aspect of bonsai, in my opinion, and what sets it apart from a lot of other art forms is the element of time. So while most works of art are static, sort of created as snapshots in time to be viewed or experienced in perpetuity forever as they are, in working with living plant material, bonsai is necessarily subject to change over time. I just mentioned this a little bit, but let's dive a little deeper into this. So, of course, branches, they perish, foliage elongates, the overall design shifts. Sometimes it can be a subtle shift, sometimes it can be a dramatic shift, but the variable of time is often overlooked in defining bonsai. So for me, though, I view this as perhaps the most important definitive aspect of the art. So in creating, designing, or altering the appearance of a bonsai, we are doing so, or at least we should be doing so, with the explicit understanding that the decisions we're making at any given point in time can and will manifest themselves in specific, predictable ways in the future. So this could be within a few days in a single growing season or decades down the road. I've talked about this in previous podcasts, particularly when we were talking about the sort of long-term orientation of Japanese society as a whole based on a cultural level. That long-term foresight is something that's allowed the Japanese to produce the quality of bonsai that they have. But it's this recognition of the variable of time that sets the trees in Japan apart from anywhere else in the world thus far. But I think foundationally, as part of the definition of bonsai, this is a necessary component that we need to toss in there. So I think the definition of bonsai should also include an understanding of bonsai as an emergent art produced through the application of short-term and long-term maintenance and horticultural techniques. So let's dive a little deeper into this. Again, we just mentioned this earlier, but I want to dive deeper into this. So not only are techniques for maintenance necessary to keep our chosen medium of living plant material alive and thriving, but they're also a part of the cumulative design process in bonsai art. So I often find that the sort of greatest common emphasis in this field is placed on the initial bone setting aspect of design. So, taking a tree from the mountains, taking a yamadori that's completely raw, finding the best angle, finding the front, bending the big branches into place, making massive changes to the tree. Of course, weight should definitely be given to this area of bonsai design, but in my opinion, not at the expense of or to the diminishment of the cumulative effects of proper maintenance on the design and form of a bonsai. This is a particularly potent argument in relation to deciduous species trained as bonsai because the results of both good and bad maintenance techniques become super, super obvious in the winter, obviously when the trees have no leaves on them. I talked about this again in previous podcasts, but the idea of long-term orientation, thinking way, way out, making sure that the proper techniques are applied to the trees. Over time, if you apply the proper, say, defoliation techniques to, let's say, a trident maple for 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, year after year after year after year, on a consistent basis, the end result is a beautiful bonsai. So there's that element of time in there, but there's also this element of making sure that you apply those techniques properly, because at the end of applying those techniques properly over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, the art itself emerges from that process. So bonsai is an emergent art. It emerges from the continual application of proper horticulture techniques, proper design techniques. It's not all about major bone setting, shifting this big branch around from the back of the tree to the front to hide this or frame this or show this off. Of course, that's a major element to bonsai, but you shouldn't focus on that at the expense of understanding that bonsai is an emergent art, and it emerges from the application of proper technique for decades and decades and decades. So not only is bonsai an emergent art, it's a cumulative art as well for the same reasons, and also because trees will often get passed from one person to the next. So each subsequent person will add, whether again subtly or dramatically, to the design of the plant, shifting angles, removing branches, changing species through grafting. Of course, this process adds to the provenance of a bonsai, and of course to the uniqueness of the art as a community practice. So I think it should be noted that this communal effort can be, but it's not always, collaborative. What's fascinating about bonsai in Japan is that the larger cultural context, which places a lot of value on subtlety and nuance, which again we discussed before, has influenced the cumulative component of bonsai art. So that's basically to say, while a single tree might pass through the hands of multiple different professional artists, the stylistic differences between each artist are often only slightly perceptible in Japan. And again, there are elements of culture here that have affected the way that bonsai has manifested itself through those subtle elements in Japan. But it's, in my opinion, in these subtleties that the beauty and the depth of bonsai are found. It then becomes sort of a fascinating kind of mental exercise, cognitive exercise in trying to identify, the most recent artist of a given tree. So again, I mentioned this before, but there could be, say, 10 shinpaku that are basically exactly the same visually that get laid out in front of me. I'll just use myself as an example here. They get laid out in front of me in Japan, and for all intents and purposes, they look basically the same. But the subtle differences in the way that the branches are placed, how much the branch tips are lifted on one tree versus the other, maybe the width of the apex on a couple of the trees. It might be very, very subtle differences, but because I've trained in Japan and I've observed all of these trees and the different artists that put their mark on these trees, I can identify who styled which tree based on those subtle differences. And to me, that's fascinating. I find that completely interesting. So thus far, in attempting to define the term bonsai in this podcast, we have established that our chosen medium must be living plant material planted in a container. It necessitates a time variable and will necessarily change over the length of this variable. And it requires design and maintenance components that are cumulative and communally influenced, and that the art emerges from those cumulative and communal influences. So to summarize the overall point here, I think that bonsai can be defined as container-grown, living plant material, cumulatively and communally designed and maintained over time to be viewed in snapshots that punctuate the material's total lifespan. So I would say, in my opinion, that each of these components is paramount to the complete definition of what bonsai is, and that to remove any one of them is to collapse the meaning of the word altogether. I know that definition is a bit of a mouthful. It's very lengthy. It's a lot easier to say, oh, what is bonsai? Well, bonsai are container-grown trees that look pretty, or that we trim to look, like an idealized form of a tree in nature. That's I don't know. It's kind of to me that there's just no depth there. That doesn't really get at the meat or the heart of what bonsai is. So again, I say that bonsai have to be container grown, they have to be living plant material, they have to be cumulatively and communally designed and maintained over the variable of time, and they must be viewed in snapshots that punctuate the material's total lifespan. So, when one artist styles the tree, then that's that snapshot in that particular time. When that gets passed on to the next artist, that communal element and cumulative element of bonsai kicks into effect. But when that next artist styles the tree, then that's a snapshot in time of that tree's design at that particular time in the total lifespan over that long variable of time in the life of the tree. So I hope that gives you kind of a better understanding of my perspective on how to define bonsai, where I'm coming at it from, what I put into each creation that I make, and my philosophy behind defining the term bonsai. Maybe you guys have a different take on what bonsai is, and I'd love to hear what your opinions are, what your thoughts are. So again, if you want to send me your comments or questions, you can send them to podcast@bjornbjorholm.com, and I will answer those in an upcoming episode. I really do appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to me bloviate about my ideas about bonsai art. It's great to get your feedback, and I do appreciate you taking the time to listen to this. So what we're going to do now is jump into the very first mailbag. So I got a lot of interesting questions and comments from a lot of you listeners out there over the last few weeks since I launched the podcast, and I'd like to take the time to answer a few of those questions. So stick around for the upcoming section, and we will get into those questions and answers. Thank you. So the first question in this very first edition of the Mailbag here on the Bonsai Network podcast comes from Christopher St. Laurent Pednault. I have no idea if I said that right, and if I mess it up, I apologize. But thank you for your question. So Christopher said that recently he went to Japan to travel around and visit several different nurseries there, and he went to one specific nursery. We'll leave the name out here. But he said that while he was there, he sat around and had tea and chatted for about 30 minutes about his preference in bonsai and the preference of the bonsai professional he was talking to in terms of what kind of bonsai they like. And Christopher told him just how much he loves the Zuisho white pines since the professional was wiring one at that particular time. The professional responded and said that he doesn't actually like the Zuisho white pines because they're too easy. So Christopher says this professional showed him the tree, and basically that the tree took 30 years from cutting to its current iteration right there at the nursery. So that particular professional then made a comparison of that tree, that Zuisho white pine that was only 30 years old, and compared it to another tree on the property that was a bonsai, or had been a bonsai, and had history as being a bonsai for 4 generations. And the professional said, that's what I prefer. From his point of view, Christopher says, I totally understand his opinion, but on my side, I like the idea that it's possible to produce a nice tree from scratch within 30 years. So here's his question. Of course, here in North America, the context is different, so we don't have trees that have been worked on for 4 generations. What is your appreciation of the Zuisho white pine, and what is your experience working with them? What do you find are their qualities, and what are their flaws? Do you plan on developing Zuisho pines at your garden Eisei-en? Could you give us some advice on working with these trees? Okay, so this is a perfect example of what we talked about a couple podcasts back in relation to the sort of cultural context in which bonsai has arisen in Japan, more specifically about the sort of long-term orientation, again, of Japanese society as a whole. So the response of this particular professional in Japan saying, I don't really like Zuisho white pines because they develop so quickly. I much prefer to work on a tree that's been a bonsai for 4 generations. This stems from that long-term orientation, from understanding that while the trees may look similar in terms of size, the girth of the trunk or the ramification of the branches, because Zuisho white pines do develop very rapidly in terms of trunk thickening and branch ramification. So they could look somewhat similar in that regard, but to know, that the amount of work that went into that other tree, 4 generations of work went into that other tree, adds a whole nother level to the provenance of that tree, obviously. And my guess is, when compared side by side, if you really know what you're looking at, you could see the effects of age on that tree that had been around for 4 generations. So now from my perspective, I totally understand where Christopher is coming from, and I would assume that a lot of people listening to the podcast right now feel a similar way, that it's great to be able to take a tree from from a cutting basically, or a small graft, and turn it into a beautiful massive girthed, well ramified bonsai in 30 years. And to a lot of people, 30 years it sounds like a long time, but again, in the life of a bonsai, that's a snippet, just a very small snippet in time. So I do understand from the American perspective and the Western perspective why that would be a desirable species to work with. And from my perspective, I actually like working with Zuisho white pines. If you really put the time and effort into wiring them and training them, they can make fabulous bonsai. There are a few that I featured in previous videos in my old series, The Bonsai Art of Japan, which is on YouTube. There's some really great examples of Zuisho white pines in there that I've wired. Naoki Maioka, who we featured in the last podcast, in the last, I guess, maybe year or two, he's wired several excellent Zuisho white pines that he has on his Facebook page, so you can go and check those out. So they do make incredible bonsai, and I do like working with them. But I totally understand the perspective of the Japanese artist who is working on, or preferred to work on trees that had been a bonsai or in development as bonsai for 4 generations. So Christopher also says, do you plan on developing Zuisho white pines at your garden at Eisei-en? I will probably develop some there. There are a couple of folks in the States, Julian Adams in particular, who runs Adams Bonsai, who has been grafting and producing Zuisho white pines for a number of years. So I'll probably acquire some of the smaller trees from him and start to develop those long term, because it would be great to utilize that species here in the States. It's a fantastic species, or cultivar rather, of Pinus parviflora. So I will develop those at the nursery. But even from my perspective, despite the fact that they develop quickly and I do like working with them, if I can work on a tree like that, or I can work on a tree, like let's say Pinus flexilis, limber pine from out west that's collected out of the Rockies, that's already 250, 300 years old, that has that age and that beauty to it. Of course, I'd much rather work with that tree. But I will develop Zuisho because I do like the species and they do make fabulous bonsai. Okay, so the next question comes from Jean-Philippe Abso. Again, I apologize if I butchered your name. This fella is from France. So he says, please excuse my English. I'm a French frog. So we will excuse your English. So, but you have a very good question here, and the question is about mycorrhiza. So he says, how do you manage mycorrhiza of your bonsai, and how do you think adding stem cell of mycorrhizal mushrooms in the substrate when repotting is a good idea, or do you think it's a good idea? So the answer to your latter question is yes, it's definitely a good idea. So mycorrhiza is very interesting. It in nature, essentially what it does is it attaches to the root system of a tree, and it basically expands the total volume of that root system, allowing the root system to absorb more nutrients via the mycorrhiza. So it's a nice symbiotic relationship. It's not always symbiotic, and it's not always beneficial for both parties, but mycorrhiza does have a lot of benefits in nature. It's particularly good for trees in environments that are quite harsh, where there's not a lot of nutrients. It allows, again, the tree to absorb more nutrients from the surrounding environment. Now, when we're talking about bonsai culture, obviously you're growing a tree in a pot, in a container, and you are providing that tree with fertilizer, or at least you should be on a regular basis if you're performing proper techniques. So the mycorrhiza doesn't have as much benefit, and it's not as necessary in pot culture as it is out in certain natural environments, because again, we are providing and sometimes overly providing nutrients to the trees through the root systems and through the foliage as well. That being said, having mycorrhiza and adding mycorrhiza to your soil, it will add benefits. I mean, the tree will be able to absorb more of the fertilizer that you give to it, so there's definitely a benefit there. It's just not as proportionally beneficial to the tree as it would be if that tree were out in a natural environment. Okay, so this brings us to the final question for this particular mailbag, and this question comes from Jeff Aldridge. So essentially what Jeff is asking in this question is, can I talk a little bit about the sort of rapid changes in popularity of certain species, certain styles, and certain fads in Japan with relation to bonsai. He says, he believes that he read that originally 80% of bonsai in Japan were pines, but clearly changes in what is fashionable must come up against what is considered valuable. He also says, I've read that Satsuki bonsai are dismissed as too easy for the true practitioner, and I've seen real separation both in nurseries and exhibitions. So to answer your question, bonsai, it's a product, and it's an art form. So you're basically going to definitely see shifts in the practice of this as an art form and also in the market of bonsai. So, if you go back to, let's say, I would say probably the late 50s, maybe early 60s through the early to mid 70s, that was sort of the boom time for Satsuki in Japan. So, I want to give you a little bit of a background. So Fujikawa-san, my oyakata, my teacher, his father was the one who founded Koka-en Nursery in Osaka. And when he founded the nursery, originally it was a flower shop. So he didn't even do bonsai. And when he started this business, what he would do to source material would be to drive from Osaka all the way down to Kyushu, which would take several days to get down because they didn't have paved roads back then. So he'd drive down there and pick up flowers. And on one of his trips down there, he noticed on the mountainside that there were some really beautiful flowers. And he thought, I want to see if I can go get one of those plants. So in that area, he had been buying what were called tsutsuji, which it's another type of azalea, but it's very small flower, very small leaves, not really for bonsai, just for reselling. And that's why he was down there. But he saw these flowers that were much brighter, much more vibrant up on the mountainside. And he thought, I'm going to go see what those are. So he drove over to check those out, and it turned out they were Satsuki. And a lot of those trees have been growing on the mountainside for 50, 60, 80, 90 years. They've been there forever. So what he decided to do was buy one, because that's all he could afford at the time. And when he bought that one Satsuki off the mountain, it was, I believe, 7,000 yen. Now, just to give you a comparison, 7,000 yen for this tree versus what he was paying for those tsutsuji azaleas, which I think he was paying 70 yen for those, or maybe 30 yen for those. So you're going from 30 yen to 7,000 yen. It's a massive difference in price. That's all he could afford. So he bought that one tree, brought it back up to Osaka, and sold it immediately for 24,000 yen. So he thought, wow, this actually might be a really good business venture. So he started driving down more frequently to Kyushu and buying up more and more and more of those Satsuki from the mountainside, bringing them back to Osaka. And at one point, it got so popular that every time he would drive down, his customers knew when he was going down because he would inform them. And when he would get back, they'd be lined up from the front of the nursery all the way out and around the corner. So he was making bank back in the day, let's just say, with Satsuki riding that Satsuki boom. And basically, he was the first conduit taking trees from Kyushu, these Satsuki from Kyushu, bringing them to Osaka, which is in the middle of Japan. Kyushu is way down the south, so he'd bring them up to the middle of Japan. And then he was a conduit then moving those trees up to Tokyo. So you saw this wave of Satsuki popularity move from Kyushu to Kansai, which is the Osaka area, up to Kanto, which is the Tokyo area. Now, the Satsuki boom went bust. Like I said, I believe it was probably the early to mid 70s. So, it was oversaturation in the market. The popularity started to decline. So the value of those particular plants started to decline. And then Fujikawa-san's father moved from Satsuki sales over to bonsai at that point. So at that point, the mid-70s moving into the 80s and into the late 80s, like I mentioned in the previous podcast, that's when bonsai really started to take off with the economic bubble in Japan. So during that particular period, particularly right at the very beginning of that boom, so the mid-70s into right at the end of the 70s or so, what you would see were what they called sort of Rolls-Royce style bonsai, which were basically mostly pines, not always, but mostly pines that were overly full. No definition to the branches, just big masses of foliage. And this was the fad at that particular time. And as you moved into the 80s, there started to be a shift in design quite rapidly in Japan, and it had a lot to do with the economy in Japan. Basically these nurseries were looking for a way to differentiate themselves in the market. So you had people like Masahiko Kimura starting to detail wire his plants and transform plants in a much more refined and detailed way than it had been previously done. And this was basically just to differentiate that product. Of course there was an artistic element there too, but there was a business element behind it as well in attempting to differentiate those products from the other nurseries to make them better, to try to sell them and try to sell them at higher prices. So you saw a shift in sort of design preferences at that point, more towards that more highly refined type look. And during this whole process, too, there were shifts in terms of the preferences of the general public, or at least bonsai practitioners, in terms of the species of trees that they liked. So, back in the 80s and early 90s, Japanese maples were super popular. Nowadays, they're one of the cheapest trees you can buy in Japan. They're just not that popular anymore. Whereas Shinpaku junipers, collected Shinpaku, those have been basically the only tree that have sort of continually risen in terms of value, both in price and in terms of how they're valued by practitioners as well and sought after. But everything else, black pines, red pines, Stewardia, beech, Japanese maples, they've all seen these kind of waves up and down in terms of their popularity. So, as a lot of the trees right now in Japan are getting exported overseas, prices overall in Japan are starting to rise because there's less product available to sell to the market. Now, the market, obviously, the demand is down, and that's why prices have declined overall in Japan over the last, 20 years or so since the economic bubble burst, or 25 years. So there has been a decline there. But now that those products are getting shipped overseas because there's such a demand overseas, there's less bonsai in Japan. So the prices of the trees that are there are starting to rise. And I think, if the economy in Japan starts to pick up again, which it has in recent years, but if it really starts to pick up again, you'll start to see a massive increase in the popularity of bonsai because, let's not kid ourselves, this is something that most people spend their disposable income on. And when the economy is not good, there's less disposable income, which means less people are investing in bonsai. So, and that's the case in Japan right now. But I do think if the economy in Japan got any better or starts to grow and expand, you'll start to see an increase in popularity of bonsai again, and particularly popularity among younger people who will start to see it as more of a viable economic opportunity in terms of doing it as a business going forward. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that happens. I assume that it probably will at some point. But for the time being, in the States right now, I think we're starting to see a massive boom in terms of popularity of bonsai, the quality of bonsai, of course, and this is really exciting. So, what happened in the late 70s to the late 80s in Japan, I think is happening in the States right now, and perhaps tenfold. So it's very exciting times right now, and I'm glad to be a part of it. So that's going to do it for this particular episode of the Bonsai Network podcast. Again, if you want to send me your comments and questions, please do so at podcast@bjornbjorholm.com, and I'll try my best to answer those in future podcast episodes. Again, if you are interested in helping support us build Eisei-en Garden in Nashville, Tennessee, feel free to hop over to my website, bjornbjorholm.com/merch, and pick up some of our t-shirts and hoodies and sweatshirts. All of the sales from those will help us build a nursery, so we really appreciate your support with that. And we will see you guys in the next episode. Thank you very much.